Hello, this is Mr. Smith, and if you click on daily participation, you should see the resubmit button. You click on that, and a text box should open up, and you should type in the 3 most significant items from the lesson. First of all, we talked about in the previous lesson the different types of market structures, starting with perfectly competitive or competitive marketplace. We talked about oligopolies. We talked about monopolistic competition, which is not the same as a monopoly. A monopoly is completely different. It's something you talked about earlier in 10th grade. A monopoly is when there is one business that dominates an industry. So the firm itself is the entire industry. It has full control over supply, so it can decide how much it wants to put into the marketplace or not, which means it's a price maker. It can determine what the prices are by determining what that supply curve is that we look at, and they can then, based on that supply, determine where the equilibrium price is going to be. There's no closed substitutes because they have a unique product, so there's nothing else available. There are significant barriers to entry because it is difficult to compete with a monopoly, either because it has huge amounts of sunk costs, investment capital that you need to get into that industry, or it has secrets about its product that no one else knows, or it has access to natural resources that no one else has, or some other type of reason. So it's very difficult to start a monopoly, to keep it, or to start to compete against a firm that is a monopoly. It has a downward sloping demand curve, and once again, it is the supplier of a unique product. And it still has a downward sloping demand curve because unless it's an incredible necessity, a monopoly raises its prices, eventually customers will start to decrease less and less of this product, or maybe not want it at all. And even if it is a basic necessity that is absolutely necessary, like let's say somebody had a monopoly over water, people, as the price goes up, are going to start to ration it. They're not going to use it as much. So demand will start to fall as the price goes up, even in that particular case. But looking at natural or different types of monopolies, the phrase natural monopoly is sometimes used, and it's a monopoly that arises from economies of scale. It just makes sense that the bigger you get, the better this company will be, and the better a product will be, and the more efficient it is. The economies of scale arise from natural supply and demand conditions and not from government actions. And so that's the difference right there. Often companies do end up dominating industry because of government regulation or government subsidies, that is grant money that helps support them. The railroads in the United States are a good example of that. They were given monopoly status in certain parts of the country, or they were given support in their tasks by the government seizing land for them, and so on. And so railroads they did have monopolies, but it was through government interaction, so they're not the definition of a natural monopoly. Probably the best example would be AT&T. It was the original telephone company because it was the only one that had the resources, first of all, with the technological advantage, then with the investments that they had to establish a network of telephone lines across the United States. And so they were the most efficient supplier of telephone capabilities in the United States, and so they were allowed to exist as the only national player, basically, in the telephone industry for a considerable period of time. It wasn't until the late 70s, early 80s that the government decided to file antitrust suit against them and eventually break up AT&T into different parts. There still is an AT&T today, but it is smaller than its original version, and some of the other parts eventually turned into what were called the baby bells. Bell East eventually became Verizon, for instance, and there are other ones, Bell South, and Bell West, and all those other ones. Eventually, most of them changed their names. There might be one or two that are still called Bell. But natural monopolies do exist, and they take place because it just doesn't make any sense for a company to provide anything beyond, or it doesn't make any sense for multiple companies to provide when this big company having all of the assets is going to do a better job itself. And that's why governments will protect natural monopolies sometimes. Armstrong Cable has the ability to supply all the cable within Titusville because it just doesn't make any sense for multiple companies to have multiple cable lines crisscrossing town in some kind of cobweb. And so they are allowed to practice monopoly within specific areas. And you'll find that municipalities, there's one cable company, one natural gas company, and so on. So that's natural monopolies. Government monopolies is when the government control something completely, like police service within Titusville, or water and sewage within Titusville, or national military for the United States. Those are all examples of government monopoly. And the reason why it's done that, because you don't want price fights over when will the police show up to my house from this company or that company, and that company negotiates with us. Well, if you want us to come solve your crime, you have to pay us a certain amount. And so that's why we end up having government monopolies in some of those cases. And it could also be because there's market failure, perhaps because without the government support of education, for instance, not enough people will get educated, and educating individuals helps out all of society by making sure we have knowledgeable customers and employees. And so it just makes sense for the government to become involved in some of those situations. Of course, some of those get debatable. And then technological monopoly would be when the government issues protections for new creations. And we mostly concentrate on patents because we make sure that new inventors have their product protected so that way someone can't steal and sell it and they don't make any money. However, this is controversial because obviously big corporations can also get patents for their products, most notably pharmaceutical companies for a new drug that could save lives or decrease pain. They get monopoly status for it through a patent and they can charge lots of money. And so some people think that sometimes it's unethical, and patents are really meant to protect small businesses and inventors, not necessarily big corporations. But big corporations say, hey, we invest a lot of time and research, maybe millions of dollars into this new product, this new drug, for instance, and so we need to be able to make that money. And that could also include copyrights, because copyrights, trademarks, and so on can also establish a hold on a particular type of creation. And then geographic monopoly is when a locality only has one particular producer of a product. And so, for instance, if you're the only laundromat in town, or you're the only gas station on a lonely stretch of highway, people can always drive to go somewhere else, and no one else wants to invest because it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe there's barely enough customers for that one individual business. And so you're not going to see the supply of producers increase at all. So it just is the way it works out, because there's a way to get to another place to use a different laundromat or use a different gas station. Then, of course, the government is going to intervene in that particular case. So these are the different types of monopolies and the characteristics of them. Obviously, there are concerns as they can corner their market, they can control supply, and they are a price maker. And without competition, of course, there is limited room for improvement, which is one of the major hallmarks of Adam Smith's ideas on the Wealth of Nations, that competition helps improve everyone and everything. And that obviously isn't the case if there is a monopoly.